This video goes with section 74 of Hansen and Quinn's Greek and Intensive course and covers epsilon-contract verbs. You can find the material in Hansen and Quinn on pages 236 to 239. So, I'm going to start by explaining what epsilon-contract verbs even are. If you've already covered this in alpha-contract verbs, you can skip ahead to the presentation of the forms starting with the present indicative active. So far, the verbs you've encountered have been like luo and have a principal part whose stem ends just before the omega. In this chapter, you're getting a new class of verbs like poieo, poieso, epoiesa, pepoieka, pepoiemai, epoiethane, where the stem ends before the omega, but there's a complication. So if we follow the rules I've taught you from the beginning, where to find the first principal part stem, you take off the omega, that's still true for both luo and poieo, and you get these stems. But I put a little red mark around that epsilon at the end of the poieo stem, because what happens is when we actually make words out of the first principal part stem of poieo, that epsilon combines with the vowels and diphthongs of the various endings to make a different shaped ending. It contracts, and that's why we call these epsilon-contract verbs. If you're in my class, you have a chart just like this to help you decide how to combine the epsilon of the stem, which is over there in the middle on the left, with all of the vowel and diphthong possibilities from the verb endings that you know, which are arrayed across the top. As you can see, there are also alpha-contract verbs, which I covered in the video for section 73, and there are also omicron-contract verbs, which we'll cover in section 84. Here's a quick reminder of all of the things that the principal parts do, which tenses and voices they each are responsible for. Since poieo only has anything different going on in the first principal part, that's all we really have to worry about. So that means we'll be looking at all of the things that we get from the first principal part, which means the present and imperfect indicative, active, middle, and passive, and the present subjunctive, optative, infinitive, and participle in the active, middle, and passive. So that's quite a bit to cover, but we'll take care of all of it in this video. Let's start with the present indicative active. We'll need the first principal part and endings. So here's a place to put them, and here's the verb that we're going to be using. So what happens with an epsilon-contract verb is that that epsilon is going to get combined with the endings that you already know. So here we can see all the epsilons, and you already know the present indicative active endings, o, ace, a, amen, ete, usi. You just need to know how to contract that epsilon with those vowels and diphthongs at the beginning of those endings. So to do that contraction, I'm putting our little piece of the chart that has the epsilon contracts down at the bottom of the page to show you how to do it. And what happens when you do that combination is o, ace, a, umen, ete, usi. Then we're going to put accents on that will be recessive accent, but with some new contraction rules, and I'll explain those on the next screen when we actually combine these with a verb. So let's do that. We'll need our stem from the first principal part, poia, and we're going to be combining that with the endings that we know, and what comes out is poio, poies, poie, poiumen, poieta, poiusi. So now I have to tell you about this rule with the contracted accents. You start by thinking of the verbs as they are in their uncontracted form, which you can see here. And there you just do normal recessive accent, and I'm putting that in there. So the rule goes that if either of the two syllables being contracted had an accent in the uncontracted form, which you see here, that accent remains on the new contracted syllable. So I'm going to put those in. And you'll see that I followed the next part of the rule, that the accent on a contracted last syllable and a contracted ultima is a circumflex. And if the accent falls on the contracted syllable, and that is the second to last syllable, it will then follow the rules for accent. In other words, it'll be a circumflex if the last syllable is short, or it'll be an acute if the last syllable is long. So what you see here is poyo, poyes, poye are all circumflexes on the ultima, and poyumen, poyeta, and poyusi are all circumflexes on the penult because the last syllable is short. So there we go. That's the present indicative active. Notice one more thing. By convention, we show the uncontracted form poieo in the lexicon or the vocabulary or a dictionary entry so that you can see that it is a contract verb and that it's an epsilon contract verb. But if you see this word in the wild, if you see somebody saying I make or I do with poyo, it's going to be that form, poyo, the contracted form, not poieo, which we show you in the dictionary. Let's move on to present indicative middle passive. First principal part and endings. So let's see those epsilons and the endings that you already know, and then we'll do the contraction, and here's what happens. Umai, a or a, atai, umatha, astha, untai. And the same rule for accent, recessive with the contraction rules. Let's put it with our verb. Here are our stems and the endings that you know, and here's what happens when you do the contraction. Poyumai, poye or poye, poyetai, poyumatha, poyestha, and poyuntai. If we put in the accent on the uncontracted forms, it looks like this, and you could hear me already pronouncing it on the contracted forms, as you can see here. Be aware that poye, the form with the epsilon and iota at the end, is the same in the second person singular indicative middle passive that you see here. It looks exactly the same as the third person singular indicative active that we saw before. Context will have to tell you which one is which. Let's move on to the imperfect indicative active. Again, we're dealing with the first principal part, but because we're imperfect and indicative, it's going to have the past indicative augment. Here's our verb and a place to put our endings, which will have those epsilons contracted with the imperfect indicative active endings that you already know. Here's our chart to see how we do these contractions, and here's how they come out. Un, ace, a, umen, ete, un. Same rule for accent. So let's do that with our actual verb. There's the augment and our stem and the endings that we know. And I'm going to go ahead and just plunk the whole contracted form in there. And I'm going to wait until after I put in the accents to pronounce these for you because I want you to see what happens. So if I put it on the uncontracted form, because those endings are short, most of them, the accent goes back a little bit farther with the regular recessive accent than it does on present forms. And so not all of those accents are on a contracted syllable after we do the contraction that makes the final form. So here's how the final accents turn out. Some of them are following contraction rule and some of them aren't. Apoyun, apoyes, apoye, apoyumen, apoyeta, apoyun. The imperfect indicative middle passive, Again, augment, principal part 1 and endings. And here are the epsilons and the endings that you already know. And here is what happens when you combine them. Umain, u, eta, umatha, estha, unta. Let's put that with an actual verb. There's our augments, there's our stems, there are the endings that we know, and here it is in the contracted forms. Again, I'm going to wait to pronounce them for you until I put those recessive accents in. Here they are on the uncontracted forms, and this time, as you can see, in every case, they hit one of the vowels or diphthongs that are going to be combined. And so when I put in the final contracted form accents, we're going to get epoiumain, epoiu, epoieta, epoiumetha, epoiestha, epoiunta. All right, we're moving away from the indicative to the subjunctive. The present subjunctive active will take the first principal part and the endings. So since we're doing epsilon contract, that's going to be epsilons combined with the endings that we already know for the subjunctive. So if we do the contraction, you get o, ace, a, omen, eta, osi. As you can see, the epsilon pretty much just gets swallowed up by the endings, and the only difference is going to come from how the accents are going to work. So let's see what happens. There are our stems, and there are the endings that we're going to contract them with. But when we do those contractions and add recessive accents on the uncontracted forms, they all land on the epsilon. And so what happens in the contracted forms is that the accent is going to hit on the ending. And so they're going to sound a little different from non-contract verbs subjunctive active. So we get poio, poies, poie, poiomen, poieta, poiosi. Let's see what happens with the present subjunctive middle passive. First principal part and endings, epsilons combined with the endings that we know, do the contraction, and we get omai, atai, omatha, estha, ontai. And we'll follow the same rules about accent. So when we actually combine that with our verb poieo, with these stems and these endings, when we do the contraction, we get poiomai, poie, poietai, poiomatha, poiestha, and poiontai. You could already hear that the same thing happens with the middle passive as happened with the active. The accent shifts onto the ending because of the way this rule works. It's on the uncontracted form, it's on the epsilon, but because that's one of the contracted syllables, it stays there in the contracted form, and the accent sounds a little different from the subjunctive if this were a non-contract verb. All right, it's time for the optative. Again, first principal part and endings. So we're going to get epsilon and those oimi, ois, oi, oimen, oita, oyen endings that we've known for so long. We're going to do the contraction, and it's going to look like this. Oimi, ois, oi, oimen, oita, oyen. It's going to have the same rule about accent, but before we can go on and try that, I have to tell you that there are also alternate endings for the present optative active of epsilon contract verbs. So we'll be combining that epsilon also with these other endings. And we'll get oyen, oyes, oye, oyemen, oyeta, and oyesan. So when we do that with the actual verb, there are our stems, there are the endings that we used to know, and here's how they contract. We get poioimi or poioien, poiois or poioies, poioi or poioie, poioimen or poioiemen, poioite or poioieta, and poioien or poioiesan. So you could hear that I was doing the accents with the contraction rules. So here is how I came up with those. There are all the accents on the uncontracted forms following regular recessive accent rules. But very often, in fact, in every single case, those accents on the uncontracted form are on one of the two contracted syllables, and so they stay there in the contracted forms. All right, on to present optative middle passive. First principle part and endings, epsilon and endings that we know, do the contraction, and you get oimein, oia, oita, oimetha, oista, ointa. And the accent is recessive with the contraction rules. I'm happy to report that the present optative middle passive has no alternative forms in Attic, and these are the only endings you'll have to deal with. So here's how they go on to the stem of poieo. There are the endings that we're contracting with, and we're going to get poioimein, poioia, poioita, poioimetha, poioista, and poiointa. We'll do the recessive accent with the contraction rules. Here they are in the uncontracted forms. In every case, they're going to combine and have the accent still on that combined syllable. And so here's how they appear in the final forms, the final contracted forms. Time to move on to present infinitive active, which will be the first principle part, plus the ending that you know. So there's the epsilon and the ain that you know, and we'll do the contraction, and it will be ain again. So if we do that with poieo, the verb that we know now, poiein is our uncontracted form. Contracted, it's going to look like that, and when we put the accent on it, there it is on the uncontracted form, and as you can see, that means it's going to end up on the ending of the present infinitive active, and we'll have poiein. The present infinitive middle passive, again, first principle part, it's the only one that troubles us with these contract verbs, is going to be epsilon and the present infinitive middle passive ending that you know, esthai. Do the contraction and it combines to become aesthai. So if we do that with our demonstration verb, we get poiesthai, having put the accent where it goes according to the new contraction rules. Finally, we need to deal with participles. The present participle active, again, first principle part and endings. So here you can see I've got the epsilons to get added to the nominative singulars of the masculine, feminine, and neuter of the participle. And when you combine those, and when you do the contraction, you get own, usa, un. So if we do that with our demonstration verb, we'll get poion, poiusa, poiun. We're going to go ahead and put the accent in now, which is recessive according to contraction rules. So on the uncontracted forms, it looks like that, and that means it goes here on the contracted forms. Now, it's a participle, so we need to know what stems we're going to use in all of the other cases, numbers, and genders. And remember, with the active, you need to look at the genitive to see that, because we'll need to see what those third declension, masculine and neuter forms are going to do. So what we'll get is poiuntos, poiuses, poiuntos. And you can see that the accent is trying to stay persistently a circumflex on the omega, or a circumflex on the oo of the feminine, or a circumflex on the oo of the neuter, and it will only change to an acute if the last syllable is long in all of the forms. That leaves us with the present participle middle passive, first principle part, and the endings. So here are the epsilons and the endings that you already know. And that epsilon is going to contract with all of those omicrons to do the oo thing. And we get umenos, umene, umenon, which means with our poieo, our demonstration verb here, they're the uncontracted forms, and contracted, they become poiumenos, poiumene, poiumenon. Again, we'll do recessive on the uncontracted forms, and that results in these accents. And here we've got second, first, second, three-ending adjective, verbal adjective, of course, because it's a participle, and so you can see how to decline those in all the cases, numbers, and genders. So you've been very patient, and that is really all I need to tell you right now about epsilon contract verbs.